So I am Helen, this is Hannah. We're here from Vancouver, and we want to say a big thank you for the invitation. It's really exciting to be back here. I also want to apologize. Where we're sitting, there's a little bit of murmuring happening, and Andreas is kindly giving us the English Coles notes of what's being said, so we're trying to follow along as best we can, but apologies for that extra noise in the room. Let me see. Where's our slides? There we go. I just need to pull our notes up. Okay, so I guess what we are going to try to do, we're going to walk you through like a little bit of practice from the past 5 years or so. So Hannah and I are both artists, and we've worked together for 11 years now, almost 11 years. And we also produce projects independently, but our collaborative work, the work that we share is generally about context, specificity. So we're very interested in public art and the way that art finds itself in public spaces. We work together, and we also collaborate with larger groups of people in participatory processes. So we've worked on projects with high school art teacher candidates, elementary school students, athletes, television show fans, so kind of different communities of people. And because of this way of working, because of the way that we work together, we were invited to be artists in residence in Toronto, the University of Toronto, in 2012. So that's kind of where we're going to start our talk from. And this was an 8-month-long residency, which is quite a long residency, for a project called the Pedagogical Impulse, which you're not seeing there. Why's that, I wonder?
Is it taking a minute to catch up?
I'll just keep talking. Yeah, it's not advancing. I see it here, I don't see it there. Is it okay if I just keep? Yeah. So the Pedagogical Impulse was at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, led by an educator and professor, Stephanie Springay. So she was interested in, there it is, the possibilities for socially engaged art practices in school. And she'd been reflecting on the educational turn in art. This was several years ago now. So noticing the proliferation of artist-run schools, workshops, curatorial initiatives that were kind of framed around this idea of the school. But also noticing as a professor of education that this was not being paralleled in art teacher training programs. So there was this pedagogical turn in art and there was art education, but they weren't really talking to each other. And generally, when you're an artist and you want to work in a school, like in an elementary school, the existing models are things like learning through the arts, or in Vancouver, we have this thing called Art Starts. And that creates a little bit of funding for an artist to go in to a school and create one discrete object that would happen over 2 or 3 days. Oh, thank you. So it's usually like everybody in the classroom makes the same ceramic mug or something in 2 or 3 days. So discrete, object-focused, and it's generally not something that the artist in these instances, I mean, having talked to artists who've worked in these models, it's generally not something that they consider to be part of their art practice. It's just something you do for the money. I mean, I've done it for the money. So kind of an exercise. Hold on. So what Stephanie was interested in, oh, the other thing I should say about that is this idea of arts integration, which is that the art project is in service to something other than art. So learning about geography through an art project, learning about mathematics through an art project. So what Stephanie, the researcher of this project, was excited about was putting artists with participatory practices who work in these ways into elementary school classrooms to work in collaboration with students to create a different frame, this idea of longer term collaboration and looking at the entire encounter as part of the art practice. So that takes kind of current education scholarship, which recognizes that the curriculum is not just about learning objectives, but is really investigating what is knowledge, what knowledge is valued, by whom, in what circumstances, and bringing that alongside trends in participatory art practice. That was the goal of the project. So Hannah and I worked on this for 8 months. 5 other artists worked on it as well. Okay. Oh, it's very difficult to see that. So I'm just going to talk about one project that we did as part of the Pedagogical Impulse, and this was the catalyst for the publication.
Sure.
Which, yeah, do you want to?
I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. Hot off the press.
Yeah. So this project was called Ask Me Chocolates, but this map here, where you can't read any of the notes, but I can read some to you. This ended up being our project curriculum, so we produced this as we went. It wasn't predefined. It was sort of this linkage that would happen as we rolled.
I think we also started to call it the constellational curriculum.
Yeah.
In some way. So thinking about tangents and constellations of learning that weren't necessarily linear and that could evolve over time with a group of, I guess they were 11 and 12?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were asked by the school to make a link to the curriculum, so we picked this very broad category to start working, Canada and its trading partners. And for us, this was exciting because we were interested in editions and artist multiples and also artist practices of exchange. So we said, okay, we'll start there. And so all of this unfolded over about 3 months. Hannah and I were in the school twice a week with this crew of grade 6 students. There they are. Doing projects. And so the way that we started was a bit of a riff off of a David Hammond's work, a blizzard ball sale, but pretty different. Toronto is usually very snowy. There wasn't any snow this year for some reason. I feel like I got really loud again. So we went to an ice rink, we got some snow. We brought it to the school, we made some snowballs, so there was this idea of playing with commodity status. What is a rare commodity? And when we went around the neighborhood and we exchanged these snowballs, and the idea was to kind of negotiate value as we went. So people gave us money, people exchanged dances, people gave us candy, and all along, nobody ever just did an exchange like, you have a snowball and I have this, I'll make an exchange. It was always, they were always asked, what's it for? Implying that the snow had no value. So the students started making stuff up saying it was for the polar bears or climate change, or somebody said sick kids hospital. There was sort of this like bullshitting that was happening at the same time. So this just became one node, like one place to start. And then from there we kind of reached out. Okay, now this is kind of a zoom in. So on the curriculum map, it snowballs David Hammond's thinking about different forms of protest. And then from there, so each day we would sort of improvise from the last day and lead into new territory. So speaking of exchange and commodity, we finally arrived at this chocolate rabbit somehow. And thinking about its factory production, its mass circulation, the way that it's sort of spreading a certain kind of mythology along its travels. And since chocolate was quite interesting to this class, they were in grade 6, we continued along the chocolate train for a while. And for the teacher is also a really great example of many issues in international global trade and exchange issues, problems. So the teacher, elected to read a book with them about child labor issues in the cocoa industry around the same time. And then we together visited 2 sites of chocolate production. So one was the Cadbury Factory. They were really excited before we went in about the prospect of chocolate samples and, of course, all of the lore and mythology surrounding Cadbury products. And then when we went in, we were greeted by our tour guides, and they proceeded to give us a small history lesson about the history of chocolate, and aided by these, there were 3 very colorful paintings, and they featured these kind of very peaceful exchanges between colonists and indigenous people. So the kids, of course, knew better than this, and I think, so this is an interesting moment where they were sort of challenging the text here. And then what I thought was the most interesting was their reflections about this experience and really understanding that, well, just feeling irritated. And I know that because if you look at, these are the tour guides here that they've drawn, and they have eyebrows that are angry and slanted down, and sort of this reflection on feeling like they were being condescended to in that environment. And then the second tour that we went on was of a business called Chocosal, which is a social enterprise. My notes are now in Swedish. It's okay, I think. It's interesting. And they are about horizontal trade, so this idea of farmer direct trading. So this was a very different kind of experience because they got to be involved in the chocolate production. Here they are. Yes, they're all in Swedish. And I don't know if you can see, like the experience was good, but the chocolate was very dark and bitter and defined by the chocolatier as food and not candies. So no milk products were added, very little sugar. And although they enjoyed the experience, the chocolate, you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see these facial expressions, but it was not to their taste. And then after the tour, there were all of these little bits of like half-eaten bits of chocolate tucked under tables, and like a big bowl, a huge bowl of chocolate samples uneaten. So one part of this tour also involved looking at the grinding process of cocoa beans. And it's sort of like it goes through these 2 stones, and then it sort of dribbles out. It's very, like a very diarrhea aesthetic, so everybody was kind of giggling about that at the production facility. And then we were like, oh, great, now we get to talk about artist shit practices. So then we showed them a bunch of jokes about, I think artists are pretty good at making jokes about shit. So we showed them this Piero Manzoni and this piece by Wim Delvoye, the cloaca. Are you familiar? It's you feed it and then it poops. Like it's just this machine, and he's produced like 10 versions of this, and you feed it meals and then it churns out poop. And that's a multiple that gets sold in the gallery store usually where it's produced. So based on this poop machine and these jokes, one student decided to make this intestine sculpture. And then this got turned into a chocolate. So here we are, molding chocolates. So, I mean, because it was sort of this broad-reaching encounter, we were trying to figure out, it's always important to us to think about, there's the experience that we have with the kids in the moment, the investigation that we do together, but there's also something very important about sharing this beyond that encounter. And so for us, it was this series of chocolates, which were all kind of nodes of I suppose like if you refer back to that curriculum map before, these were all kind of nodes in it, all of these chocolates. So here's the students writing about it. I'll read it. I created an intestine chocolate. The intestine is a machine which was created by Wim Delvoye. It makes poop and shows how our intestine is important, because if you didn't have an intestine, the digested thing wouldn't properly come out. So if it didn't come out, you would have pain by getting constipation and other painful sickness. The artist also packages the poop and sells it. It is important that there is more than one poop. Also, I think it relates to exporting, because when the machine poops, the poop are packed, and sometimes the visitor buys the packed poop, or it is sent to places. Many people thought that the grinded cocoa bean from Chocosol was poop. And then all of these other nodes are kind of, can you pull that thing? And this is another one. The burr chocolate relates to the sticky Velcro buttons we saw in class. Burrs are very sticky seeds that grow together on plants. They have sticky points, which when touched, attach to things. Burrs help common burdock spread because when the burrs have seed in them, when they blow away wherever the burrs land, the plant grows. They are the things that inspired Velcro. Sandy made buttons out of Velcro to symbolize burrs because there are so many woods you can end up with a real sticky situation. There are so many in the woods, you can end up with a real sticky situation. The burr buttons and burrs are like multiples because burrs grow together on one plant, and there were many of the buttons. So next time you see Velcro, think about burrs. And then last, I'll just do one more, a bitter gourd. I chose bitter gourd, which was known by the group of artists called the Bitter Melon Council. I'll be more talking about the taste of bitter. Bitter is the most sensitive of all the tastes to me, or maybe it is. Well, common bitter foods and beverages include coffee, cocoa, mate, marmalade, bitter gourd, beer, bitters, olives, peel, and I don't know what escard is. I think the big idea of bitterness is sadness, like sadness in life. The Bitter Melon Council traded bitter gourd for monkey and other stuff. It was kind of interesting to me because I never thought you could trade a toy for an eating thing, and it gave me a new idea of what I could trade with my classmates. Maybe one more. The panga is a machete. It is used in Ivory Coast, a hot place, but the terror lurks within cocoa plantations. It is not the farmer's fault, it's the company's fault. The farmers work all day in the hot, burning sun, and all they get is 1 to 3p. They are getting fewer, and the farmers can't afford anything. That's why they recruit kids. The kids are being stolen, took, snatched, taken. Their weak bodies can't survive in this condition. So that one is this one. And that one is related to all of this research. They were actually very heavy research they were doing about international trade and labor conditions. I'll skip. So this became our document of the encounter, like how to kind of represent this encounter as art to an external audience.
So and this is all the info about each of the chocolates kind of on this folder. Them is illustrated here as kind of a fragment of the research. Yeah.
This is Pamela, another artist who is working on the project. Here she's trying to make an exchange for this kid's chocolate, and she has an orange, and then she has this party hat, which she's pitching as half of a Madonna cone boob bra. And she walked away with the cone bra and the orange. Like nobody would trade with her. So I think that speaks to I think they were very aware of the value of these things that they'd created. And then I also just want to mention that in the school, just thinking about the aesthetics of different environments. So in the school environment, this is the display that was in the classroom, and it has all of these kind of like signifiers, the curls font and the angles and like the tape on paper kind of aesthetic, and that existed in the school environment. But it's also very important to us as artists that the knowledge that is produced in these environments, the things that the children know is also received by an art audience. And it's very hard to speak to an art audience with this. So that is sort of why we always think about, okay, like how does one environment translate into another environment, or how can we move in between these two environments? And I think I will hand it to Hannah now.
Yeah. Are you able to see the images okay? I mean, we keep referring to them, but they're kind of...
Oh, you got to put your mic up.
Put it on an angle? No? Should I put my mic up?
Yeah.
A little bit? I'm afraid of it being too loud. Okay. So we were preparing this talk yesterday and kind of got lost actually in all of the material and going in these rabbit holes of all different PowerPoint presentations we've given about this project, and thinking just what a crazy task it is to have to reduce this to a story that we can tell you. And I suppose that's why it took 5 years to make this book, to figure out how to translate this story. And so like Helen mentioned, the class always evolved from one session to the next. So depending on what came up, like for example, the bathroom humor, working with 10 and 11-year-old kids, there's brown goo coming out of a machine. It's really obvious that then you make some poo jokes. So things really evolved like that, and we tried to entertain everything as best we could when it came up. And the teacher was very, very supportive. It was a really wonderful adventure that we produced together. And so, yeah, this idea of themes surfacing, and then kind of having the luxury of time to respond to them as they came up. So it was very much a meandering kind of curriculum or project, and then kind of this process of distilling everything into the chocolates that then functioned kind of as these story fragments. If we produced a counter-narration of value, how then do we translate this counter-narration for another audience? And like Helen, I'm sure people are familiar with different artists in schools kind of formats. And we were very adamant that this be in the center of our practice, not something that was done as kind of a side, as a side project that we wouldn't claim as our own work in some way. So yeah, we were like, how do we make people care about this counter narrative? And so when we'd finished, we had all these questions that we referred to for years as danglers, like things that were kind of unresolved that we needed to figure out in some way. So the book became kind of the excuse to think through these questions, and also a way to map out our future projects that we'll mention if we have time. I don't actually know how long we've been talking. How long have we been talking, Anna? Okay. So danglers. One main question that actually I don't know if we know the answer to, but thinking about whether inhabiting the curriculum could be claimed as a form of curricular practice or curatorial practice. So thinking about like the role of the curriculum, it's a document of some kind that anticipates learning outcomes. It threads together ideas. It produces some kind of an inquiry, and could that be understood as a curatorial practice in some way? And so we really did, in the end, when we were putting this together kind of as a document or as a kind of exhibition catalog, we really did think about this process as curatorial in some way, because there were so many artists' works that we were sharing with the kids and that they were sharing with us that came into all of these themes that we were examining. This is in our studio, kind of trying to map out all of the themes that had emerged. There's also the question, why does documentation so easily become snapshots from a process, and what more can we demand from a visual language to represent our work? So this image does something, but it also makes us quite uncomfortable. So how do you share a process in a way that that maybe doesn't have to show subjects, or can show subjects in the form of a chocolate, for example? So we're still working through this. In our current project, we have quite a rigorous rubric with which we produce images, and we're always trying to produce a bit of opacity, I guess. So not illustrating everything, leaving things a bit of a mystery, and and really trying not to take these kind of ecstatic type images. Even, I mean, they do function in a certain way, but we're trying to problematize how these images work. And then thinking about artist multiples, so each of these chocolates were made as an edition of 10, and the kids got to decide how they were bartered for, or negotiate what the value was. So there was the Madonna cone boob bra, but then there were other amazing things like, I don't know if One Direction was popular here, the American pop band. So there was all this spontaneous trading for a chocolate and I'll sing you the One Direction hit. So there was these kind of spontaneous performances. And then also kind of contracts that documented, like, I will give you a chocolate if you teach me how to skateboard after school, or you'll teach me how to play soccer. And then some of the trades with the parents were like, I don't have to walk my little sister to school if I give you the chocolate, trading off for chores. So yeah, we're still thinking about multiples and how they function kind of as a publication, both as a document, but also maybe a fragment that becomes its own work that then circulates in some way to tell a story about the project. So these are the, this is at the trade fair. It was total mayhem. All the kids, like there was a lot of work up to this event, so all of the different classes kind of got a briefing on what our 4 months of research had been. And this is a lightsaber actually in the foreground. So kids were trading, and kids had made trades in advance, like a lot of negotiations beforehand. Like, if you bring me your lightsaber tomorrow, I will save a chocolate for you. And just back to the bathroom humor. I think a question that we're still trying to figure out as to queer women, how to be out in the space of an elementary school classroom, and then how does a queerness kind of emerge? And I think in this instance, really entertaining the bathroom humor felt like a version of what that could be, and that's still something that we're working through and trying to think about. So that was another dangler, is how do we talk about this in terms of a queer practice? And then also thinking about how the visual language of candy and sweets and chocolate works. How are these desires manufactured? Who defines taste, and under what circumstances is taste kind of defined? We were with them. Sorry? Yeah. We started 2 days a week. I think like Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for maybe an hour and a half each. Yeah. And then I think we thought we would finish in 2 months. And then this is the case with all of our projects, is you start rolling with something and then you realize all of the things it could be, but also all of the things you have to resolve somehow in the process, so that everybody arrives somewhere together. So I think in total, it was 4 months, 2 times a week. Yeah. Yeah. So with the language of chocolate, thinking about how desires are manufactured and how taste is defined. And I don't know about here, but in Canada, at every corner store, gas station, there's these amazing kind of graphics that are these like floating treats in space, with all this amazing, these amazing logos. We spent a lot of time developing logos for each of the chocolates, and that didn't seem to work. We spent a long time trying to figure out what this would look like, but we were trying to riff on this kind of candy aesthetic. Another dangler was trying to think about how an edible artwork can invite a closeness with the perceived other in some way. So this artwork emerged many times, and it's part of the National Bitter Melon Council of North America, and they were an art project / PR advocacy group that advocated for the value of bitter melon in a North American context. And their their slogan was like better living with bitter, something like that.
Better living through bitterness.
Better living through bitterness. And it not only came up thinking through trade and exchange, but also because the kids thought the dark chocolate was so bitter. And that was a really interesting moment for us because Helen and I, in our liberal kind of like consumer conscious minds, thought that we would just make everything out of this beautiful dark chocolate. And the kids were like, no way, we're not making things out of this beautiful, ethically produced dark chocolate because won't have a currency in our. So there was a real coup, and it went on for a while, and finally, it was a great lesson for us that whatever we produced together had to have a currency for them in their world. So it was, we did end up finding really nice milk chocolate as well, and some chose to make their multiples out of dark chocolate. But that was one of many incredible instances where desires for the project were not necessarily in parallel and had to be negotiated. The book. So I think when we're thinking about producing this, it's also about claiming these projects at the center of our practice and thinking about that very, very seriously in terms of working with children and what our production or methodology is. And the book in the end, I think we felt quite resolved about the research with the students and then also the products that were produced, and I think it really had value in their world. And for us, the book was not necessarily to facilitate any kind of access for the children then after the fact. This was about somehow translating the research to a larger community, and thinking about producing our own access in proximity to children. So what is it that they offer us in our practice? We're always thinking about this. We continue to put ourselves in relationship to children with our projects, and then starting to kind of name what that is. Why do we want to be around kids all the time? And what is it that they give us? What is it about their spirit and their irreverence and kind of feralness? What does that kind of do for us? We're definitely trying to be careful about making that a reciprocal process. So we're not just showing up to give them something. It's more that they're giving us something. And so one of the final danglers, we had a friend who's an artist who also had a child, and she was also trying to name this thing, why do I want to replicate what my daughter is doing in my own studio practice? And so she started to think about this question in terms of parent anthropology, or the idea of accessing a second wonder, or a recuperation of something that she had lost, and then finally coming to this idea of the contact high that she would get from from watching her daughter. So she talks about that in the book. And we always like to refer to this artwork. It's by General Idea. They're a Canadian art collective. And they worked in performance and multiples and media. They also, they made a practice out of inhabiting these available kind of forms. So one of their very famous projects was a beauty pageant that was kind of inhabited by artists. They always talk about this idea of developing an audience vocabulary. And this is something that's very important for us, that we're producing the work, but also being quite firm, trying to be very firm about the circumstances in which our work is received, and trying to develop an audience vocabulary. So manipulating what is recognizable, making visible which which is otherwise invisible or unacknowledged. So physically how the book functions. Kind of showed you this part already, but it felt important to have the kids' voices kind of front and center and physically wrap around the book, which in itself is kind of more theoretical, discursive texts by adults. So that's kind of physically how it works, and we tried our best to acknowledge all of these danglers that we talked about. And we do have this for sale. This is a real sales pitch. If you want to buy this, we have many, many copies. We just got it a week ago. And I guess it's an opportunity to think also about how this functioned as a map making or a wayfinding. It definitely informed our current work that we're doing right now in Vancouver. And as we stepped away, we thought a lot more about candy and what candy is. It's a cultural phenomena that kids tend to get absorbed by. They're very aggressively marketed to with candy. And also candy is this tension point between adults and children. So a lot gets negotiated around candy. And also once you inhabit this idea of candy, you can make it do something else. So with this project, we started with chocolate, and then it allowed us to research trade and commerce and labor practices. So with Big Rock Candy Mountain, the idea was that we're riding in on this like candy wave and thinking like the kids will probably be bought in some way. It's very manipulative, but thinking about how to start at a place where kids are thinking about currency in their lives and what has value. Just need to figure out how to scroll. Do you know where the mouse is?
No.
Okay. Just a little bit of context for Big Rock Candy Mountain. It's an ongoing project that started in 2015, the fall of 2015, although we were writing grants for it a year before, so the fall of 2014. So we were able to start almost 2 years ago. And what's really important about this work, it's supported by a public art collective that produces temporary works in public spaces. So their mandate is kind of to think about individual perspectives inside shared social spaces, and then thinking about the aesthetic, economic, and regulatory conditions of public life. So our friend Vanessa Kwan has functioned kind of as the curator and the producer. And what we aren't showing you, which is probably familiar to many of you, are all of the meetings that we've had with different funders, with the principal of the school, the teachers, all of the work that went into negotiating this project into being.
Can I interject something?
Yes.
I think what might be relevant about this project in this context is that the previous project, the reason we've kind of showed you them together is the previous project was an institutional, the frame was designed by an institution, Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and we operated within the frame that they designed. And then I think through that process, it was a very generous frame as well. We were there for 8 months. I think that's quite generous. But I think for us afterwards, we wanted to design our own frame. And to really kind of design the terms of our own engagement. And so that's what's different about Big Rock Candy Mountain. And the way that we design the terms of our own engagement is really related to all of this thinking we did with people in the publication. Mm-hmm. That's all.
Yeah, so we really worked to create a platform that could be really weird, that could be difficult and challenging, and something that could evolve over time. So the school also is located in a very particular context. It's in East Vancouver, and East Vancouver is very economically diverse, culturally diverse. There is a really big indigenous population of students, and also it's kind of the home of many waves of immigration to Vancouver, Chinese, Vietnamese, Italian. It also has an amazing community of artists and queers, so this is kind of also quite important in terms of where we're starting and who the people are that we are working with. And when we got there, we also started just to survey the visual culture of the school. This is really nostalgic for us, having grown up in Canada, these kind of like stock borders that you can buy and staple onto these kind of like very provisional cork boards in all the hallways. And then thinking about each student's desk and thinking about the culture of the desk and what happens, and all these things that now have bigger and bigger eyes than they used to have. This is universal, bigger eyes, yeah. And then Shopkins, which are these toys that you can buy in a store and they all have eyes on them. So Shopkins, we learned, are very, very popular. And there's this whole like YouTube life of Shopkins where people are like animating them with these really tiny squeaky voices. And so we're really trying to pay attention to what the kids are paying attention to. Here's a note we found on somebody's desk. Shopping list, 1 medium, Slurpees, large, 5 that looks like it got turned into 6. 6 large Slurpees, a Kinder Surprise egg, 2 hickory sticks, big bag. And the school is located across from 2 gas stations. Those are the only places where you can buy food. So super trashy, junky food, but also something interesting in there in terms of honoring kids' agency, or what it is that they would choose to buy, and then thinking a little bit more about how they are making those choices. And this is definitely related to the visual culture of the school. Everywhere around the school and on the playground are these kind of packages with this iconic zigzag cut. This is very much indicative of an industrial process. And this iconography is important. We'll come back to that. And then also thinking about like people's bodies in school, and thinking about school as an environment that really regulates people's bodies, and for us trying to pay attention to how that space gets subverted, or what a kind of refusal looks like in that space, and trying to honor the subversion in a way that also doesn't undermine the teacher. And this is something that's still very much in practice. It's trying to pay attention to how kids are performing and refusing in this space. And then that brings us to the question of like how it is that we also enter the space. And if you don't want to be an adult or perceived as a teacher, what do you do? And our kind of solution, our solution for the first day was that we tried really hard to dress up as jelly beans so that we wouldn't be perceived as a teacher, but maybe more like mysterious idiots in some way. The name of the project takes its name from Big Rock Candy Mountain. I don't know if people are familiar with this song. It's an American folk song that emerged after the Great Depression, so in the 1920s. And it really illustrates this world, this kind of anti-authoritarian world where there's whiskey trickling down the rocks, lemonade springs, all of the cops have wooden legs, and the bulldogs have rubber teeth. All the hens lay soft-boiled eggs. So imagining this kind of utopia, anti-authoritarian utopia. And this kind of was the starting point for the inquiry. Like, if you were to imagine in this school right now what Big Rock Candy Mountain would be, what would it be? And so there was a lot of bacon that came up. People wanted a lot of bacon in Big Rock Candy Mountain. Also candy and cake. And then things like bed. Somebody wanted a bed at school so that they could sleep. So this whole kind of range of desires, some of which were really intense. Seems to have frozen again. Well, I don't know. Oh, nope. I might need your help. How are we doing for time, though?
11.
Maybe we'll wrap this one up. Yeah.
I was just going to say that, to use your microphone, we didn't put a slot of questions in your talk because we wanted to give you free hands to do however you like until we go for lunch. Do you want me to give some time for questions and me to lead that?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just show two more?
No, but what I'm saying is then, Anna, you could just tell me when there's about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
And I will do some questions, okay? But now...
Yeah, it seems to be stuck. Okay. Okay. Is it okay if should we wrap it up before 20 minutes? No?
I don't think you can jump the images, but you just scroll past, okay? Whatever you like.
Yeah, funny. Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Should we kind of fast forward to the chocolate bar and take questions?
Yes. We're going to fast forward through this first project. Although I think it's important to pause here. So we still have a lot on the PowerPoint. So I just skipped through some and then we'll...
I don't think we should do the whole thing because I think it would be good to have questions. Okay.
Yeah. One of the first things we did also when we were thinking about Big Rock Candy Mountain and also thinking about food and taste and how it is you describe flavors, that's kind of thinking about taste in a very literal sense, but also thinking about taste in terms of cultural production and value. So this is something that kind of weaves in and out of the project and continues to do so. So this is one of the first surveys we did, what is good taste and what is bad taste? And I don't know if it's easy to read from where you are. So good taste in this instance is paper, tastes really good. Carrot, sap, yam, nut, pea, cocoa, flour, water, burger, and burnt toast also tastes really good. Pencil shavings are bad. Ink, sugar's bad. The student wanted to write poo, but the teacher said you can't write poo, so he did cow manure. Found a really good workaround. And this really, really amazing phonetic spelling with this one. Good taste gummy worms, Sour Patch Kids. Sour Patch Kids a thing here? Very much American candy. Want, not sure what that is. Lollipop. Bad taste, sushi, sunflower seed, nail polish, eraser, chalk, fly tastes really bad, shampoo, chalk. So we've been following the work of Jack Halberstam as well. His recent writing thinks about the queer art of failure, and in particular kind of starts looking at CGI films for kids, and then starts to articulate these ideas of low theory and kid knowledge. And so in this quote, he says, "Is kid knowledge always in bad taste and always opposed to adult culture? Are there ways of reorienting our mature conceptions of taste to allow for the possibility that children's culture, even in its tackiest forms, has something valuable to offer adults?" And that's kind of expanded upon more in the book. And then just quickly we'll talk about this project, which is very much oriented around mouthfeel and taste. And this was also quite a long research project and started differently than the other chocolate project, but also wanting to work with chocolate again as something that already had a currency or a value. But the questions were like, how do we work with chocolate? In what ways do we want to produce something? And how do we get there together with the group? So when we first met them, the day before this, somebody ended up talking about smoothies, and they wanted to make smoothies the next time we were there. So when we came back, we brought all of these things for smoothies, including things that they wanted to try in a smoothie, like chicken and jelly beans, and then made this kind of Wheel of Fortune spin a smoothie to make all of these kind of flavor combinations. And we did this for weeks and weeks, like tasting things and then trying to figure out how to describe what the taste is. And so some of the language was really amazing, like a velvet purple smoothie, or a bango smoothie, I don't know what that means. Bark red or dark blood with skin, also very appealing. Makes me think of when we eat dinner with barf. People know what barf? Like vomit? Okay. Or scared, nervous, makes me think about apricots. Or thunder with green apple. I want to taste this. This is good. And then kind of like coming up with against the limits of language, I think, and starting to think more about how we could use synesthetic images or how a shape could describe a flavor. Some of these are more kind of literal than others, but I think some of them are really give you a sense of what the flavor might be or hear. And then finally using these emojis to talk about what a flavor is. And we also started realizing that sour candies have this really amazing currency. And there's these crazy, so like we're always trying to pay attention to what happens on the playground as well. And often there is a lot of candy that gets exchanged in these playground networks. And we learned that they're really into these two types of candy. One is called warheads, and the other one is called toxic waste. And they both have these like nuclear explosion graphics with eyes on them. And yeah, and they're super, super sour, and that is what the appeal is that they're just so crazy that can you even handle it? And like, oh yes, I can, I'm going to prove it to you. So all of this stuff going on in the playground and realizing that sour really had a currency. So starting to refine what we might, working with the idea of inclusions in chocolate, what would we put into chocolate that could represent some of these taste experiments that we were doing. So this whole inquiry, again, into chocolate and how it's made happened over months, and we visited the place where the chocolate is made, which is also in East Vancouver, which is also situated as a social enterprise. And they make bean to bar chocolate, which means they do direct trade with the farmers, and then it is all roasted, winnowed, ground, conched, tempered, and formed at their facility. So it's really, again, it's really, really beautiful, precious chocolate, very much oriented around adult tastes, who are the people who can pay for this kind of chocolate. It's not the cheap kind that kids can afford. So that was something we were trying to figure out how to negotiate. And it actually, there was a lot of behind the scenes negotiating, thinking about what the inclusions could be and where the kids' choice was to bring in kind of their world and their own agency and their own, something that had value to them. So these are sour gummy worms. We kind of refined the list of choices to, 10 different sour things. So there were nerds. I don't know if nerds Okay, nerds are these little tiny crunchy sour candies. Also, they have eyes. Sour sponge toffee, barberries. So we had some, and lemon zest. We had a range of kind of manufactured sour and more natural sour. And then they each got to make an edition of 4 chocolate bars with their own packaging and marketing, which we also spent a long time talking about, like, what is the language of packaging and marketing, and how do you know something's for kids, and how do you know something's for adults, or where do those things blend together? And they're very savvy about how marketing works. And I think before anything ever moves outside of the school, we're always trying to resolve kind of how it lives as something to be very proud of in the school environment. So this is the display case just in the hallway. One of every student's chocolate bars was here, including these kind of facial expressions that describe what the flavors are. And we were wrapping this project up in June of last year, and the students were about to go on summer holidays. And so it was agreed that Helen and I would take all of this research and then somehow produce a compilation bar of some kind that was in some way the results of all of these things that we had tested. And this compilation bar would go out into the world, so something that would function both in the school environment, but then could be this kind of edible publication that would then circulate in other places. So we also have some of these for sale. Really doing a sales pitch. We're still thinking about the language of candy and also the sound of candy and kind of the tactile qualities. You may be able to imagine what East Van Roaster's chocolate looks like in terms of packaging. It's very like unbleached, paperboard, quite precious, very expensive. And definitely this packaging is kind of an affront to the aesthetic that they're working with. But this also is very recognizable to children as something that they know. And I think we need to think more about how that works. We've been thinking about how it works for us in terms of a visual language. We spent a lot of time at the gas stations across the street from their school. Oh, these are nerds, yeah. And this candy, there's a lot more to say about this one, but this was at the gas station. It's a syringe with liquid sugary candy in it. So it really, I mean, this really like illustrates this parallel of candy and kind of substance use and abuse, particularly in Vancouver. And there's a lot more to say about that. We're really thinking about harm reduction and choice and how to think about like safe use of candy and working to kind of inhabit that conversation more. That there's a lot more work to do. But one thing, like as we were thinking about the design for this, we were also going through all of our drawings the kids had produced, and it's really uncanny that if somebody draws, often, I don't know, 9 times out of 10, a kid drew a chocolate bar and it had these zigzag edges, super iconic. And so we were thinking about how candy could perform in drag in some way, or what this idea of realness, like performing a realness as a critical position, that you're inhabiting something that is economically or aesthetically out of your paradigm, I guess. So thinking a lot about drag culture and inhabiting candy but doing something different, and then really working with the zigzag as a form of this industrial realness. And we didn't have a large enough run of the chocolate bars to actually run it through a conveyor that would cut it in this way, so we did it by hand. So the irony is actually these are more artisanal than any any of the other chocolate bars. Like the production of the packaging was very particular. They were heat sealed by hand on every side. I wonder if we should end. Should we end there? There's a lot more to say, but maybe we'll.
Yeah, let's cut it out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen and Hannah. We met the first... Oh, I got that in my eyes. I have to stand here. You could stand here for a while then. Together.
Up here?
Yeah, come on.
Okay.
The first time I met you, it was because you invited the Bästa Biennalen to your course at the Malmö Academy Critical Studies and
Pedagogical Studies.
Critical and Pedagogical Studies. So, yes, you're all here. The students are here. It's really nice to see you.
Thanks for coming, you guys.
Yeah. So I'm glad you invited us to come and present Bästa Biennalen as a part of your course for the students. I love the way that you could see the connection. And I'm thinking of what Eva-Marie was talking about, that övergripande project is to be norm critical in some way, but not, to make things better, with the purpose to make things different and better somehow. You said it so well in Swedish. But
we missed that part.
But somehow
Will you paraphrase it for us?
But it was so nice because somehow I hope that you had this sense when you invited us, and I think that we've had really good conversations beforehand. So, because what I'm thinking of that you did not say so much about now, but that I thought a lot of when I came to your presentation at the Academy was, I'm trying to put this together, but you were talking about contact high more, and you were also talking about camp, the aesthetics of camp. And I'm trying to, so for me, those two, that was kind of an aha moment for me, because I love the way that you talked about how your original motivation was creating art that was contact high, that would have the purpose of creating art moments of contact high, and that was your artistic practice somehow, and how that led to working with kids eventually. That travel, that's what I was hearing. I'm not sure if I got it right, but anyway, that was a fantastic way. And then also how you talked about camp aesthetics. I don't know if you're familiar with camp, but
we have a quote that we could read.
Yes, good. And then and how you tried to translate that so that the students or the pupils, what's called elever, you were working with, could understand the concept of camp and how powerful that concept is of change and it's kind of creating a new space, empowering, making people equal in relations, and also maybe leading to contact high. This is, I'm not being very clear here, I know this, but could you just say something about camp and contact high? And then I'll open up, and then we'll open up for more direct questions.
Sure. Thanks. So contact high, that was this idea of why work with other people? And we've tried to articulate it in many different ways. I think at one point we were talking, when you're on a trampoline and you're bouncing, and then you can do this thing called the double bounce, where you both bounce at the same time and you go up twice as high. Trampoline thing. So just trying to think of a language to figure out why involve others in creative practice. And then contact high kind of came up with Sydney, who wrote this paper in the publication, just about the like getting a hit, or like getting sort of like, there's these sort of ecstatic moments that are happening in the elementary school, and getting a hit of that, and then that sort of fueling the process. Yeah, so
I think contact high was something that we wanted to describe in some way as something we were getting, not something that we were necessarily producing, but as a way to explain why we put ourselves in proximity to kids. Is that there's this contact high that happens, or that, sorry? Yeah, and it's like a motivator in the practice, I think. Like, I know these projects in Toronto were very stressful. Actually, we were managing 5 at the same time. And I think this one emerged somehow as the strongest or most relevant, or perhaps we had the best connection with the kids. And I remember that 8 months as being also very stressful working conditions for an artist, but also every time we left the school, there was, 15 amazing things that had happened that we would spend, it really was, created a buoyancy for us, that made us keep wanting to go back. Yeah. Should we read the quote about camp? Because I feel like I don't know how to riff on it right at this very moment. But I think in terms of working with a camp sensibility, I'll just read it. Camp is polymorphous and perhaps even perverse. Camp sensibility, unlike the sensibility of the romantic child, but like that of another child type, is artificial and unrefined. Or is it? If camp does share such attributes with childhood, then perhaps camp has something to offer us in the way of understanding it, albeit partially children's culture. Camp aesthetics disrupt or invert many modernist aesthetic attributes such as beauty and value and taste by inviting a different kind of apprehension and consumption. Words such as kitsch, bad taste, mocking, and nostalgia emerge in discussions of camp aesthetics. Beauty and value diminish in importance as audacity and energy come to the fore. A camp aesthetic delights in impertinence. It likes to challenge rather than satisfy. Its satisfactions derive from a sort of jouissance of acceptance. So I think this is really helpful for us as kind of professional artists circulating in a contemporary art community, whatever that is, and making something that doesn't look like a kind of removed, cool art product, certainly that can't hang on the walls. So I think it's been really helpful to try to identify what this is doing or how this is functioning, and we definitely talked with the kids, and they don't talk about things in terms of a camp aesthetic, but the idea of parody or inhabiting something familiar with something else is very familiar. And I think one of the kids said it, like something that's so bad that it's good. So I think, they wouldn't describe things on these terms, but they do have a very nuanced understanding of these shifting forms of value, I would say.
Thank you. That was good. I just wanted that to be in there. So, what time is it, Anna? Okay, so we have like 10 minutes for questions. The sound in here is not very good, so it's best if we all have the microphone when we have questions. So, anyone out there? Anything particular?
Hi, thanks very much. I really enjoyed learning about your work, and I wanted to ask, did the kids perceive you as teachers or mysterious idiots or something else? Like, how did your relationship with them develop throughout the project?
It's I think it's very difficult to get away from like sort of the teacher persona, because we are in the space of a public school and we are adults in that space. And we're also leading workshops often. So we try these little methods to undermine it, like the jelly bean costume, or just like in the ways that we communicate with them. But I don't think they perceive us quite as teachers, and that is also sometimes a problem because we don't have authority. So an example of that is we ran an after-school program like a year and a half ago in the same school, and it was like unhinged. Like there were moments where I had it's this thing you want to kind of, you're operating within the structure of power and you're trying to undermine that structure of power, but you also are relying on it to be able to get things. So it was I'm not sure to the answer to your question, but I think it's a bit wavy. Our authority kind of comes and goes. Aya has a question back there.
Hi, I was just wondering, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on if you sort of perceive your practice maybe a little bit as a way of having artistic research together with kids or in collaboration with kids. It could maybe, if you see that you're sort of researching kid culture or you're inviting the kids into artistic research, or if you can sort of see some connections between that field and what you do.
Yeah, I think that it's both. It's nice to think about, we're positioned as adult art professionals in some way in an art community, specifically in Vancouver, and there's something very exciting about claiming the students as our research community. I think it's both, and then it just makes me think of what we're doing in the next year, which is really trying to design a research process. Not sure what to say about that, other than it's both. But what more is there to say? I'm like drawing a blank.
Yeah. I mean, I think thinking about who you talk about art to, like another thing that we did was this artist lecture series in the elementary school, and just thinking about, this idea of an extended art community. So as if we as adults have the most important, I feel like we sort of think of ourselves as having the most important conversations about contemporary art practice, and then what does it mean to bring artists into the elementary school and have those practices discussed in that environment. And I found that really valuable because I love those discussions. And so maybe this sort of extended community, or sort of a more porousness of art community, where it's not kids come in to learn something from us, but rather there's sort of something more dynamic happening.
We could talk about this one as an example.
Well, this is Frank. Does anybody know Frank? She calls herself America's favorite Jewish lesbian folk singer. And this is her in drag as Hot August Frank. She's doing Neil Diamond performances. So talking to the kids about that, just her gender performance is really interesting, and being able to have conversations with them about that was great.
And I would say just a bit of background about Frank. She's old school American butch, and very much identifies of that generation as being a woman, performing as a man, and she has this amazing haircut. We also talk about all of the visiting artists' haircuts, because they had a lot of amazing hair, but she has this kind of flat top that she's had. It's very iconic. She's had for 30 years. So I think this was also a way for us to extend the idea of how queerness arrives in an elementary school. And in this case, she's actually describing how she's performing drag, how she had to attach the chest hair. And the kids were like, oh, yeah, you would have to do it. Okay, yeah. Just kind of thinking through this gender performance with her, asking her about her haircut. She also used the word lesbian, and people had follow-up questions about what that meant and why she'd used that word. We're really going on a tangent from your question, but I think, in terms of defining a research community, also it extended to bringing other artists and visiting curators and educators. A lot of people came over this series and ended up helping out with this series, yeah. No pressure.
Well, I was just wondering if you, Eva Marie, have anything you'd want to know more about before so you have your stuff for the afternoon conclusion. Do you need the microphone? Or do you want to say that?
Hi, thanks for everything. I'm thinking a bit about something that you said earlier, so it's a while back in your talk, about that the knowledge produced by the kids is also packed in a way that can communicate with the art world. Mm-hmm. And it would be interesting if you could elaborate on that. Why is that important? And to you, I mean, you're artists, and it's a way to communicate with your colleagues, I guess. But it would be interesting to know something about that. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I guess because fundamental to the work that we do, I guess interrogating this idea of learning somehow, and and this idea of development, that somehow we develop into adults, and that childhood is pre-developed, undeveloped. But this, I think central to what we're doing in this idea of the contact high is that there is some fundamental knowledge and excitement and energy there, So perhaps there's something nostalgic in this as well around childhood, too. But this really treating these encounters and conversation as important. They think it's important. We think it's important, and because it's so important, then we're obligated to share it as if it is. So I think it's just something about value, because I think so often when earlier on, we sort of mentioned the model of artists in schools, and I think there's always these, kids say the darndest things kind of encounters, and people come out with quotes, but what is produced there is sometimes not considered as a form of art practice. It's considered something else. And maybe that's interesting, but for us, it's very important to center this and to give it this kind of value and importance. And then also everything that we're researching is about this kind of taste. It's all this interrogation of what is taste, and for who, and how can we kind of flip it upside down. Mm-hmm. Does that address or answer? I think so. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Big applause.
Thanks for having us. Should we take this off?
Yeah.